I guess we're really coming in hot for 2025. In case you've been living under a rock, on December 4th, 2024, the CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, who ran a massive for profit company in healthcare, was fatally shot. This prompted a lot of reaction, as you might expect, and both the act and the reaction across different groups have captured my imagination. In a way, it felt like an American equivalent of the assassination of Shinzo Abe, where the act is polarizing but quickly occupied a significant space in online culture, and because that's happened, there's been an awful lot of reactions that are, for want of a better term, shooting from the hip. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong about that, but I wanted to both give this time to settle, for I made a video about it, and just kind of couldn't be bothered because it was the end of the year. Sorry, not sorry. It's circling back season. Come on. This is me circling back. A particularly fascinating thing that happened in both of these cases is that normally when someone is assassinated or killed, we express sympathy across society for that person. Like, if a senior politician is assassinated or an attempt is made on their life, generally you see sentiment towards them or their party improve, often temporarily, but it's usually noticeable, especially if someone comes out and criticizes that person or even approaches the idea that it may have been justified, because they'll get shut down usually. In these cases, though, that wasn't the universal reaction, and that's an interesting break from the usual pattern. That's not to say that no one ever in the history of everything has believed an assassination has been justified after the fact, but it was interesting to see the doohickey or the contraption that Tetsuya Yamagami used on Abe become a meme. Also, for his assassination to precipitate both action on the issue that motivated the assassination and a continued decline in the popularity of the LDP in Japan, though there will obviously be more factors than just an assassination calling attention to dodgy cult connections that contributed to that. Similarly, when Brian Thompson was shot, there wasn't much in the way of sympathy. Pretty much as soon as his identity was revealed as the victim, you saw people sharing anecdotes about their experiences with United Healthcare. You will be shocked to learn they were all negative. Sorry, there's no real spin on that one, I'm afraid. You'd also see the fans of right wing and far right media personalities get angry at those personalities in a way that feels kind of hopeful because they were like, why are you distracting us from the real problem? Which is one of the oddest sensations you could get from an event like this. And I promise we'll at least talk about that a little bit. What I want to do in this video is understand why people reacted the way they did, or at least offer a thought as to why that happened, whether we can learn anything from that reaction, and answer some of the more tiresome questions and commentaries around this, especially from the press, who seem to have panicked a little in the wake of this. But first, let's talk about Engels. Allow me to bring in the concept of social murder. My explanation and everything related to this is going to be pretty directly lifted from Engels' book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is where the term was coined. At least that's what it says on the internet, and the internet has never lied to anyone ever. Also, there's a stray bit of hair that looks terrible. The short explanation is that social murder is an unnatural, premature death that isn't caused by direct violence, but by social, economic, or political conditions. Let me explain it by presenting two different sequences of events. The first is the one that I think we'll all understand immediately. Let's say I decide one day that I'm just going to go get a gun and go out into the streets and find someone and shoot them in the head, intending to kill them. Abstracting it from any cause, what I've done is an act of interpersonal violence that has artificially and through imposition shortened someone's life. We know what this is, and we know what the word is for this. It's murder. The person in this hypothetical who was murdered may have gone on to live for 20, 30, 40 years if I hadn't intervened and decided it was my place to shoot them. In general, and I'm sure this is somehow going to be controversial to say, we would recognize what I did in this hypothetical as wrong. unjustified and probably unjustifiable. While crime and criminal are not neutral categories, it would definitely apply to me in that case, and in the UK, I'd be facing some kind of prison sentence for it, I assume. I don't think they let you sort of walk out from that. Setting aside how we feel about the carceral state and whether we think prisons are actually a way to provide rehabilitation and restorative justice, there is at least some consequence for murder if I get caught. The other sequence is one where I think people sometimes don't see it as clearly. Let's instead say, instead of a random act of violence, I decide to open a factory that makes a product that produces like hazardous byproducts in the manufacturing process or something like that. Of course, I have to obey the law in terms of the exposure of workers to these conditions, and I know it could shorten their lives. But I really, really, really want to make the most money I can, and I make more money the closer to the line of the law I play it. So maybe I cut corners in a way that exposes people to these hazards. And it doesn't instantly kill them. Like, no one's getting eaten by the machines, but constant exposure to this creates long-term health issues for people who work for me. Maybe they're even aware of this, but they can't quit the job because they need the money. So they keep exposing themselves to these conditions, and perhaps it shortens their life by 10 years, 20 years. They just die earlier than they would have done otherwise. Now, this is just one example of how you can do this to people, and we'll talk about some other ones by necessity, to be honest, in a little bit. But how is what I've done in the second sequence different from the first? On the surface, it's pretty obvious, right? In the second example, it's not like Cluedo or Clue. There's no weapon, there's no place where the murder happens, and to quote Engels directly, the death of the victim seems a natural one. So some people will say that the first example is categorically murder, but the second case with the factory and putting people into conditions that shorten their lives isn't really the same, because did I break any laws? Did I shoot the person? Did I directly kill them in that moment when they died? Did I force them to work for me? The thing is, maybe I didn't shoot the guy who works for me, or who I have power over, who I can coerce into living in conditions that shorten their lives. I did still murder that guy though, didn't I? If we're talking about social murder, yeah, like, it's the individuals who die, but it's the power of capital, the control that the capitalist class have over the conditions people work and live in, that gives it that deliberate element that puts it in the same category as murder. In general, we're good at understanding interpersonal iterations of lots of things. People understand interpersonal racism, misogyny, and violence relatively well. It's why when you accuse right-wingers of being racist or sexist, they bring out a woman or a black person who supports them. And to be honest, we see through that a lot more easily these days, or at least I hope so. And so with social murder, we're kind of seeing through the, how did I murder them? I only put them in the conditions that shortened their lives excuse, which is just real Frank Reynolds from Always Sunny shit.
You kill him? Not directly, but you could make a case that the condition didn't do any favors.
Oh yeah, the conditions didn't do them any favors. Yeah, we know what that really means though, don't we? In the specific case we're talking about, it's clear what the analogy is here. The alleged shooter, and I'm emphasizing alleged here, engaged in an act of interpersonal violence. They found Brian Thompson and shot him dead like a dog in the street with bullet casings that had the words delay, defend, and depose on them. At least, was that? If that's wrong, you can fact check me, but I think those were the right ones. It was clearly an act motivated by anger towards the health insurance industry in America. I'll definitely get into some anecdotes later on in the video that are going to be relevant, but for now, the headline thing we need to understand about what Brian Thompson did for a living was that his job was to maximize profit for United Healthcare. His job was not to provide high-quality health insurance to regular Americans, because if it was, then his company would make less money. It's as simple as that, really. I don't really have anything to add to that. Brian Thompson United Healthcare and the entire privatized health insurance market in the US profits from the restriction and denial of healthcare to people. An act that causes premature death, that forces people into the conditions that cause their deaths on purpose. Are we getting it a little bit? There was this backlash to the positive reaction that's best summarized as you can't draw an equivalence between Brian Thompson and the alleged shooter. And you see, they're not wrong. They're just not right in the way that they think they are. A lot of these people are invested in focusing on the interpersonal aspect of this. The alleged shooter is, at best, a vigilante taking justice into his own hands, which might lead one to ask, why did they feel the need to do that? But of course, that would mean looking at something that isn't interpersonal necessarily, and therefore isn't relevant to murder as they want us to understand it. What the people who say you can't draw an equivalence haven't realized, or maybe they have realized this, is that, yeah, the alleged shooter killed a guy. You wonder how many people have died because they were denied access to medical treatment by their insurer or by lack of insurance at all. The anecdotes that flowed after the assassination alone would put Brian Thompson and his industry's body count at an astonishing level. A rate of murder that a single person could never match. Like, it would be difficult to do at best. So yeah, there is no equivalence. Social murder is a much more brutal and efficient machine than a hooded assassin. We can, and we will, talk about whether an act like this could be justified, or how it could be justified, or whether it has any utility and what its impact could be. But to murder on an industrial scale is not morally equivalent to that. It's worse. The US health insurance industry is more evil than any CEO murdering assassin. The great thing about social murder as a concept is that it's really easy to understand. Like, people can intuit it, and I think talking about things through that frame can be really effective. Like, if you came to this video and you had no idea what it was called, like what the idea's name was, I'll bet you had a rough idea of what the concept meant, which is why this section is a bit lighter than usual. You don't need me to go into it because we get it. It's part of the reason why this is cut through so many lines. To give an example of how using the term is effective and how many different applications it can have, I'd like to return to the first time I'd heard a senior politician use the term, which was the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. God, remember when people like that could have senior positions in British politics? Anyway, he once used the term to refer to the deaths caused by the Grenfell fire, and I was kind of surprised at the time. It was actually good politics to use the term in this way, because a lot of people understood that the cause of the deaths wasn't just that there was a fire, but political decisions that were made that were intentional, which then led to those deaths. He was right to say it then, and I think he also said, or at least it's been said, this has been said about the UK's austerity program, which we can't get into, but again, deliberate policy that'll cause conditions that lead to premature. Let's circle back really quickly. Normally, when someone is assassinated or murdered, it generates sympathetic reactions and coverage. I know that there are exceptions, but just bear with me. And I totally understand this, even if I'm on the side of we don't speak ill of the dead unless they deserve it. It's something that I think we would want for ourselves, that if this happened to us, people would be sympathetic and understand our families and our loved ones' loss. As I've said, that isn't exactly the reaction which emerged, which caused what I can only describe as some of the most bizarre attempts at concern trolling, and honestly, some degree of hysteria from your usual sources, including the media wheeling out people who are suddenly all, oh, we shouldn't endorse political violence, which is an interesting belief to suddenly come into in some cases. One of the highlights for me was Elon Musk in the aftermath appearing with his son publicly, which I think we could only really interpret as a reaction to the death of Brian Thompson, given how quick people are to point to, oh, he's a father, he has a family. Like, the people who die from social murder don't, but All right, whatever. The best moment, I think, by far, was when Piers Morgan had a man whose head looks like it was rendered in a PS1 game, Peter Thiel on. For real, I'd never seen Peter Thiel before this and was a little surprised at the shape of his head. But he really seemed to struggle against the idea that the alleged shooter was a hero. Which, given the alleged shooter did just kill someone in the streets, is what I'd call something of a fumble. Like, how do you struggle to argue against that? Honestly, watch the clip in your own time. I have the timestamp up on the screen when I show you the clips. It's amazing how badly he fares with this question. It reads a lot like someone who's trying to recover from a point that's so cogent that they know they're full of shit, but whose life depends on disarming it, which, you know, who's to say it doesn't in some cases? I'll come back to what this reaction by prominent capitalists signifies, as well as their allies in the press, but the TLDR is that it does kind of look like they're a tiny bit afraid. I'd never suggest anything, of course, but the fact is that these are people who exist as corporeal beings, who have addresses and places that they go. Perhaps in that context, they're justified in feeling a tiny bit afraid. There's like a stray piece of hair that keeps moving, and I really hate it. But that's not the main point here. So let's get back to how people who aren't richer than God or who do their propaganda reacted. How can I put this? People absolutely lost their shit once the news broke, and things had become clear that we knew someone had gunned down a healthcare CEO on the streets. It was quite something seeing how people were reacting to an as yet unknown person who had done this. That's something I want to make clear about all of this, which is that the positive reaction occurred before we even had an idea of who could have been responsible, which speaks to the depth of feeling, since there was no motivation known at the time, and for all we knew, it could have been a totally random act of violence. Yet, the general sentiment was a person who profits from denying people healthcare getting killed was good. Just in the abstract, the sensation appeared to me to be catharsis. I say all of this to counter a point that came up in the wake of this, which was that people were only invested in siding with the alleged shooter when the accused was an attractive young man, which led to this accusation that this reaction was motivated more by racism than by other things, which is odd for a number of reasons. Firstly, this positive reaction to the shooting was almost instant before any details came out either about motivation or who could be responsible. Secondly, we don't exactly have a massive sample size of CEO killers of various demographic backgrounds and levels of attractiveness to compare it against. You know, just like scientifically, right? I think if your position is that we should be sympathetic and opposed to the alleged shooter, then this is probably one of the weakest positions you could take. There are probably people out there who do want a wider sample size, you know, just for science, right? But they probably don't want it just for science. They don't want it so that we can assess the validity of the "it's because he's white and hot" hypothesis. Let's be honest about that. But I will say that those things probably do matter. More attractive people have it easier. You know, I'd know. But primarily in terms of how the police treated him, because American police do not have a good record with non-white people, to put it mildly. They don't even have a particularly good record with white people either. But, you know, but my point is, it does matter. I just failed to see how we could know that it matters in that particular way. So I'm just going to dismiss it out of hand. Even if the alleged shooter is an attractive man, no one's denying that. Once we had images of the alleged shooter and then he was arrested and identified, people's opinions solidified, because it's easier to have an opinion about a name than just like mysterious hooded man. Which way did these opinions solidify? Well, it depended more on your age than anything else. So older people had a negative view or a more negative view of the alleged shooter, and younger people had a more divided opinion that came out mostly positive. Basically, if you were older and more conservative, you had a really negative opinion of him, and if you were younger and more left-leaning, you had a more positive opinion. kind of makes sense when you think about it. It's worth noting that these factors can act separately from each other because, as we'll see, there's been an interesting degree of support across the political spectrum, including some colourful looking characters showing up outside of courthouses to give surprisingly cogent points about the whole thing. And the particular clip I'm showing you, the person identifies himself or themselves as anonymous, which is a real throwback, to be honest. It's worth noting that at least in one of these polls that was taken, Luigi Mangione was more popular than the American Congress, which makes sense given that the American Congress is probably collectively responsible for more deaths, because of that social murder thing we're talking about. There were a lot of different ways support was expressed. The most interesting for me was the folk ballads about the assassination that became a whole thing, which, can we just acknowledge that if we're at a point where folk songs are being posted on social media about someone, that maybe there's some organic and maybe even justified anger at the health insurance industry or at society at large. It wasn't just folk ballads, of course. I just found that a particularly charming expression of it. When you have this kind of reaction, I think we're beyond the point where it's, like I saw some people saying like, oh, it's foreign interference, it's all Russia, because of course it's always Russia, right? Yes, like your favorite liberals said that, obviously, or people who are like, oh, it's just edgelordism, you just want to be an edgelord, or about the fact the alleged shooter is white. But you have to wonder about the terrorism charge if he is that white, but I'm not really going to open the "Are Italians white" can of worms in this video. The alleged shooter has become a part of online culture. I've seen people invoke him in various ways, in various situations, from shitty landlords to other CEOs who are apparently hyperventilating about some most wanted CEO cards some person made. Which, can I just say, if you don't think you're doing anything wrong as a CEO, then why are you worried? Are you doing something wrong? Maybe you should tell us if you are. I don't know. It just seems like if you're reacting like this, you think you're doing something wrong, and it might soothe you to share the burden. A burden shared is a burden halved, right? Another interesting reaction following the arrest of Luigi Mangione is that crowdfunding for his legal defense emerged. I think GoFundMe pulled the one on their site because apparently people accused of violent crimes can't raise funds for their defense there, which is a bit of a weird one because we're meant to be treating the accused as if they're innocent. Seems like someone made a judgment there, but whatever. Instead, there's one on Give, Send, Go, I think it is, which is raised at the time of writing the script over $200,000, which is a lot of money. And I get that people will come in and say, oh, Luigi Mangione comes from a wealthy family and he can probably afford a proper defense, family can pay for it. I think it misses the point a little bit. I don't think people care about his background when making this decision. It's about a depth of feeling, the viscerality of it, and the fact that for a lot of people, they believe, for reasons that we'll probably talk about a little bit, that this is the closest to justice they'll get on this type of person. So they want the accused instruments of justice to get the best defense that he can. Just to illustrate this depth of feeling, I want to share with you some of the random comments that I picked out from the donations made on the website. Literally, I will go to it during editing and just pick random ones. I've already got some saved up. They'll be on the screen now, and it's curious to me how many of them make explicit reference to class, how many are specific about having been on the receiving end of the health insurance industry's denials, how many implicitly invoke the idea of social murder, if not in name then in principle. The ones I'm showing are just a handful. I mean, you can go look and see the comments for yourself. It's all there, and it's really fascinating how moved people are by this and how much it crosses political lines. There's one particular comment I want to draw attention to because I think it highlights how this assassination broke political containment. And I know what this person means when they say it's not a right versus left issue. They mean that the experience of healthcare in the US isn't determined by your political position. You could be a communist, you could be the wettest liberal, or the kind of guy who watches Trump sway with the American flag for 40 minutes. Which is apparently a real type of person out there. Anyway, look, for most Americans, their experience of this is the same, so it cuts through. Having cleared up that I completely understand what this person is saying and what they mean, I do want to go on a tiny tangent slash rant, which is that I want to make the point that the experience of health insurance and the reaction to the assassination of Brian Thompson is not a left versus right issue. Like, does it correlate to some extent? Yeah, of course, but given how polarized America is, it's pretty surprising for it to have the purchase it does across the political spectrum. That being said, it is funny how many issues are often described as not a left versus right issue when only one side of that equation is actually trying to offer a solution to the problem. I don't know, it's just a curious thing that I've noticed, and it's nothing to do with the comment I'm talking about or people who say this. But I would have been mad if I'd not mentioned it. Like, how often is it that it's like it's not a left versus right issue, but the left are the only ones with the solution? Pretty often. How does something resonate across political lines like this? Not to do that thing where you just gesture vaguely at something, but look at the state of American healthcare. This is entirely anecdotal, but when you're a YouTuber, you do end up getting to know Americans. It's kind of the nature of being an Anglophone channel, and this is not an exaggeration. Every single American that I know has told me an anecdote about US healthcare that has stunned me. Look, in the UK, we have the NHS, which is creaking under the weight of austerity and privatization, but I've never heard anything quite like what Americans tell me about their healthcare system. I just want us to imagine, those of us who do live in countries with universal healthcare, how angry we'd be if any of our relatives or loved ones died because they were denied necessary healthcare because of an insurer for profit. I can't help but think of a recent loss in my own family, which has caused me and a lot of others to be grieving, and a small part of that process was anger. Thankfully, my relative who passed away just before Christmas did so despite the best efforts of medical professionals, not because their healthcare was just denied for profit. If I felt a bit of anger about that relative's death, I can only imagine how intense it would have been if that was the mechanism by which they died. It doesn't bear thinking about. And in the wake of the assassination, you also saw a lot of anecdotes about times when United Healthcare and others denied people healthcare. I think of one in particular that was posted by a doctor who said they denied their patient who was in a coma healthcare because apparently they couldn't show that the treatments they wanted to do were medically necessary. Which, I mean, how are you meant to feel about the people profiting from that? Like really, I'm genuinely asking. This anger, it stems from the practice of social murder and people understanding it, and people, they can describe it accurately. They may not be able to name it. Maybe giving it a name will help people out there somehow. But to think about Brian Thompson for a minute here, I've seen the defense of him, or at least a reasoning as to why we should at least be respectful of him in death, is that he never broke any laws, did he? And also that he has a family, but all those people who died being denied coverage also had families. They also had people who cared about them. He's not fucking special, and I don't care. This idea of him not breaking any laws exposes an interesting tension, because it's true that in his role as a healthcare CEO, he didn't break the law in a way that would result in him being punished. It's almost as if crime and categories like criminal or terrorist aren't neutral categories. Something to think about. There was no way that Brian Thompson would ever have been punished for what he did at his job. There just wasn't. Even if you could produce credible accusations, good luck getting a CEO into court for any crime. Which does raise the question, what recourse do we really have to change or challenge practices that amount to social murder within our political system? I'm reminded probably of one of the more pointless GCSEs I had to take, which was citizenship, which for those not in the UK, or maybe even those who didn't have to take it because it was compulsory at my school, it was basically like a surface level introduction into how civil society worked in the UK. I think in America you'd call it like civics or something. It was taught by the hero of this anecdote, my future head of sixth form at the time, who handled probably the dumbest thing I could have said in a class really well. But anyway, one day we're having a lesson about the ways we could try to change, political policy, And she asked us for suggestions. And before I tell you what I suggested, let's talk about what the normal people in the class said, frankly. So my classmates suggested these kinds of things, right? Peaceful protest. Makes sense. Voting for candidates who agree with your position. Again, I get it. In the liberal democratic framework, that makes sense. Organizing within your communities to build support, maybe to produce some of those candidates we talked about. Writing to your elected official. You get the idea. It's the usual stuff we're always told to do. I suppose my question for those of us to think about before I tell you what I suggested is, do we think the political system responds to these in a way that solves the problems we have? Or do we think the systems that are supposed to respond to these pressures have legitimacy anymore? I don't think so. I don't think we believe either of those things. So there's a crisis of both legitimacy and insulation from public opinion and isolation from it. Now, not all public opinion is created equal and is good and correct, of course, but let's say we do organize. Let's say we do have this mass support in our communities and we do pressure our elected representatives. What if they just don't care? And what if the only plausible replacement for them is someone who just doesn't agree with us or care? That's how you end up with assassinations. It's also how you end up with my answer to the question. Now, before I tell you my answer, I want you to bear in mind that I was 15. It was still pretty war on terror at the time, because it would have been 2009, and I was ostensibly Muslim, and the answer I suggested was terrorism as a way to effect change. Now, to be fair to my incredibly white British teacher, she handled it really well and said, yeah, terrorism could be a tool to try to change policy. And I assume because I wasn't visited by police that she didn't report me to some de-radicalization program. So shout out to her. I hope she's doing well. She was one of my best teachers at that school. Honestly, really one of the best ones we had. In essence, what I'm saying is that liberal democracy's approved methods of petitioning policymakers just don't work, and we know they don't work. And in that circumstance, can we be surprised that people lash out and that a segment of society celebrates those who lash out? I don't think so. Does that make it inherently good or right? Not necessarily, but it does make it something that's at least logically consistent within itself, and you'd think there'd be more interest in understanding it from some. I want to spend a bit of time at the end here just collecting my thoughts about all of this, because there's a lot of things that have gone on, and I think the utility of understanding social murder and giving it a name that speaks for itself is, it's pretty well understood, and I think it's relatively obvious how it fits into all of this and all of the reactions from all parts. Like, Elon Musk isn't showing up with his son in public, not least because the man is incapable of familial love, unless he understands that people think he's evil. And I think he does understand that. I think he's pretty stupid, but he's not that stupid. Instead of focusing on that sort of thing, I want to focus on some of the things I saw that inspired this video and what I think about them. Firstly, I want to address the reaction by the press, which has been odd, but best described as somewhat panicked, linking this back to how intuitive social murder is as a concept. I know I said I wouldn't talk about it, but I'm going to a little bit. It's hard not to read this as them understanding that there's perhaps some pretty legitimate anger out there, and the last thing media outlets, which are largely owned by very wealthy people, want is for this kind of act to be legitimized. The fact is that in a country like America, with the rates of gun ownership and the gun culture they have, it's, if anything, surprising to me that something like this didn't happen sooner. It's also kind of rich to talk about a generalized fear that political violence is being normalized when there's political violence all the fucking time in America, but the right in particular engage in it all the time. Also, just look at the history of America in general. Look at it on a map and think about it for a second. But also, there's a guy who strangled a homeless person who's hanging out with Donald Trump at football games, I guess. Just admit that what you're opposed to isn't political violence per se, it's just political violence that happens to hit people you like, Just be fucking honest. I hate the hypocrisy argument, but it's especially rank here, and it serves only to highlight that crime, criminal, terrorist, or any of that sort of term just isn't neutral, and we should be critical of them. We should be openly critical of them. I did see one boring, tiresome discourse around this that was essentially about whether this act by the shooter, whoever they were, was strictly speaking a leftist act, or even about whether he was a leftist or not. And I don't think it actually matters at all. I think it doesn't. Who fucking cares? Like, what matters is what we, in the broader sense of we, make of it. Political violence is not a tool that belongs solely to any particular part of the political spectrum, nor is it inherently left-wing. But who the violence is directed towards and how we interpret it as a society and what motivated the action is what's important, at least to me. Sure, the alleged shooter is a weird center-right tech bro-ish person, at least according to the information I have, who, you know, according to his manifesto, supposed manifesto, is pro-cop. So what? Like, a lot of people have also pointed out as elite background and education, to which I'd say you can be the good type of class traitor. It is possible. Yeah, like, communism and socialism isn't about being the softest ooh small bean alive, but it's valid and important to be critical of individual acts of violence, especially in relation to achieving what we want to achieve, because it doesn't usually. Just personally, I do think that, like, vigilante justice is scorned for a good reason. Once you unleash violence, you don't necessarily know how that's going to play out. And I think in the strictly hypothetical situation where you are asking that question, you ought to be very cautious about it, especially when the overwhelming force and organization is on the other side. In this case, though, I keep coming back to something that I said earlier. Like, what recourse do people really have to see any justice done to the people who are killing us? And it's that sense of justice being done that's underlying a lot of this, especially when you consider how badly the American authorities have fucked this in front of the whole world. Every picture of Luigi Mangione in court or on his way to court makes him look, one, really cool, two, really dangerous, and three, kind of Christ-like. They fucked it so bad he's gone international. I was talking to a friend who lives in Japan recently, and she just dropped that she supported him when I mentioned this video that I was working on when I was working on it, which blew my mind that she just came out and said it. But maybe it shouldn't have. We're all suffering, and we're all finding out that the ways we were taught to address suffering don't work, or just don't, or the people who are behind them don't care, which leaves us asking, what else is there for us to do? Like, beyond the usual, but it's hard not to feel like we're running out of time and options. Not just in the US, but everywhere, and that is kind of scary. My last serious thoughts on this relate to how this act and the accused Luigi Mangione have been absorbed into memes and pop culture. There's an argument that goes something like this, which is that this absorption blunts the political potential of the act. And I do agree to some extent. My objection here is less that I don't think that's true, and more that we've been saying this about a lot of different things for a long time now. A lot of us are native to that kind of media environment, or at least well adapted to it. If you're saying this is the case, and I do agree with you, then to some extent, if you're a native of that mode of producing culture, then it's kind of your job to figure out how to maximize political potential if you think it exists and if you think it's important. I also think this line of analyzing it ignores how you can draw a pretty direct line from, like, right-wing online culture to the hoarding of actual real-world political power by the right. Of course, the rules are different for the right because the capitalist class always boosts them as their vanguards, but it's not impossible. It's just harder for us. And maybe we need to get smarter about it. I don't know. If I ever have thoughts about this, it'll be a whole other video, folks. Just a whole other video. Not the time, not the place. I do also think that one of the saddest and most understandable feelings I saw expressed about this was hope. Not just because an evil person was killed, but because it suggested that there is an understanding of what's happening, a class consciousness, almost. Maybe we could say, we might say it. Anyway, if you did feel hope or a sense of justice from this action, I don't blame you. It's rare that the people responsible for our mass suffering see any kind of punishment, which says a lot. And I can't really say much more than that, and hope to keep this video up on youtube.com for very long, so let's move swiftly on. I guess to end the video, what I want to say is that jury nullification is when the jury in a criminal trial gives a verdict of not guilty, even though they think a defendant has broken the law. Just something to think about for no reason at all. If you happen to be on the jury, I guess. Anyway, peace. I'll catch you all on the next one. I need to thank my proofreader who did an excellent job of proofreading this one. I also need to thank Emir for my thumbnail. It is a banger. Whichever thumbnail you saw, it was made by him. I also need to thank the wonderful people who are on my Patreon and who are YouTube members. If you want to support the channel, please go over to patreon.com/SKTheCrusader or join right here on YouTube if you fancy supporting it. You know, that's just it. But if you don't feel like supporting it like that, remember, like, subscribe, comment, always good. But with that, I want to give a special shout out to the top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Mercutio, Curtis Shider, John N, and Liron, and to our YouTube members, Nader Jiwa, Roger Zugi, and Scaly Bubble. Absolute legends all round. If you want those shout outs, if you want the videos early, if you want all of that good stuff, you know where to go. I already mentioned it. But also, remember to like, comment, subscribe. Keep yourself safe, and I'll catch you on the next one. What do you think? The shirt, is it too much, or is it just right?